For nearly a century, official maps labeled Sector 12 of Antarctica as dead ice. Located 200 miles inland, it's a frozen void, where the wind strips paint from steel and temperatures drop so low, human survival is impossible. There are no weather stations here, no active military presence, just 3 miles of solid ice. But on December 4, 2024, the South Pole Listening Array picked up a signal. At exactly 3:17 a.m., an emergency broadcast bled through the static on a frequency that hadn't been used since the 1930s. Analysts traced the isotopic distortion of the audio, finding a match with antique equipment. A man's voice, brittle and terrified, repeated 3 words: "Come below, cold." Radio ghosts, old transmissions bouncing through the atmosphere, are common, but this was no recorded loop. On the 4th night, the signal added a word: waiting. On the 5th night, it added hungry. Something beneath the ice was actively building a sentence, appending new vocabulary every single night. Archaeoacoustics expert Dr. Elias Mercer led a specialized team into Sector 12 to find the source. Beneath the snow, they discovered Station Perseus, the remains of a 1931 British expedition camp that had officially vanished without a trace. Inside the frozen tents, Mercer found the crew. 7 men, perfectly preserved in their sleeping bags. Every single body was positioned in the same direction. Their eyes were wide open, and their heads were turned south, facing downward toward the glacier floor. They hadn't frozen to death in their sleep. They were listening to something directly beneath them. This topographical scan shows the thermal readings Mercer's team pulled from the glacier floor. 300 feet below the camp, they detected a massive radiating heat signature, and it was oriented vertically. Whatever was down there was alive, and it was standing up. When a fresh crack opened in the ice, the team recovered biological tissue. It looked like hollow white fur, but the DNA sequencing showed an impossible hybrid of human markers, canine sequences, and genetic strands that have never been cataloged on Earth. That night, the team's radio operator vanished from his tent. Hours later, at 3:17 a.m., the transmission broadcasted a new message. It used the operator's exact voice to say, "Found us." The entities below were utilizing biological mimicry, perfectly imitating the vocal cords of the person they had just taken. Mercer descended into the caverns alone. His recovered helmet footage revealed smooth, breathing tunnels lined with thousands of words scratched into the ice. At the bottom, he found hundreds of entities. They weren't just making noise. They were testing syllables and repeating human vocabulary in unison. Biologist Mia Calder noted that the words weren't being used for communication. They were structural. She realized that the rhythmic mezzodance of the broadcast was physically vibrating the ice, creating circular fractures. For these entities, language is a tool of construction. Each word added to the sentence acts as a necessary component to physically open a path to the surface. Following Mercer's disappearance, military operatives deployed thermal charges to collapse the cavern. The mission failed. The surviving soldiers didn't die in the blast. They began reciting the words from the broadcast, infected by a signal they were never supposed to hear. By 2032, a psychiatric anomaly began sweeping across the northern hemisphere. Dr. Naomi Wren, a neurologist, noticed Keishans from Alaska to Russia reporting identical symptoms: severe nosebleeds, compulsive writing, and hearing voices inside static. And every incident occurred at exactly 3:17 a.m. This schematic illustrates the mechanism Wren uncovered. When she slowed down recordings of the signal, she found hundreds of layered voices whispering beneath the hiss. These audio patterns rewire the listener's brains. The signal is a cognitive infection, transmitted purely through the act of hearing. The symptoms escalated. Entire populations in remote fishing villages and research outposts began sleepwalking in synchronization. They would stand barefoot in the snow, heads tilted, acting as biological relays to broadcast the final missing words of the subterranean sentence out loud. The signal is an active neurological architect. By embedding layered commands in the white noise, The broadcast conditions the human brain to act as a physical relay for the next phase of the transmission. Station Perseus was not an isolated site. Declassified files revealed 12 identical towers buried beneath ancient ice across the planet, from Greenland to Siberia to the Himalayas. 12 sleeping nodes, waiting for enough human minds to learn the words and complete the transmission. When an infected population recites the full 31-word sentence, the Earth geometrically and suddenly splits open. In a fishing village in Greenland, a retired fisherman spoke the final missing word. Seconds later, a perfectly symmetrical 300-foot hole opened beneath the town, releasing the first wave of MIMICS to the surface. The 12 nodes were extensions of a central intelligence. Deep beneath the Himalayas sat the first mouth, an apex entity the size of a cathedral, coordinating the global breaches through the infected human network. These entities had been dormant for millennia, but in the early 1900s, humans built massive lattice towers to send the first long-wave radio broadcasts across the globe. Those signals penetrated deep underground, bleeding through the rock and ice. Our reliance on long-wave radio was our undoing. The same signals that allowed us to speak across oceans reached deep enough into the ancient ice to signal our presence to a species that had been waiting for us to get loud enough to find. Knowing the military couldn't shoot a frequency, Naomi Men and Father Tomas turned to history. They scoured the Vatican archives, looking for evidence of previous breaches, tracing cave markings and Sumerian tablets that referenced voices from the deep. Inside a broken Akkadian tablet, they found a specific acoustic cancellation phrase. It was an anti-prayer that created a perfectly opposite frequency pattern to the infection. It roughly translated to, "Silence binds what speech awakens." This cancellation required physical proximity. To sever the global network, the counter-sentence had to be delivered directly into the subterranean epicenter of the first mouth in the Himalayas. Tomas made a descent alone. Bleeding from his ears and surrounded by thousands of mimic voices, he threw himself directly into the shifting opening of the entity. As the glacier cracked around him, he spoke the Akkadian syllables. The response was immediate. The tunnels collapsed and the global breaches stopped. Because the invasion relied on the structural resonance of the sentence, the only way to halt the awakening was to introduce a specific, disruptive frequency that broke the signal's coherence. In the aftermath, survivors gathered in remote valleys and concrete bunkers. These settlements became known as silence zones, strictly enforced communities shielded from any remaining long-wave signals. The world adapted to rigid rules. Governments shut down all analog frequencies. Microphones and electronics were banned. Citizens were taught to remain absolutely silent every night at 3:17 a.m. to prevent reinfection. 3 years of quiet passed. Then, an unmarked package arrived at Naomi's cabin. Inside was the frozen, century-old reel-to-reel tape recorder from Station Perseus, accompanied by a note in Captain Vale's handwriting. The tape contained Tomas's voice, broken but alive, warning that the entity was dreaming again. Then a massive, ancient voice spoke through the recording, stating, "When you speak to the stars, they speak back." Humanity hadn't stopped the invasion. By plunging the Earth into total radio silence, they merely forced the first mouth to change targets. At exactly 3:17 a.m., Naomi's dead radio cracked to life, and it said a single, entirely new word. "Hello."